Obviously meet at a pivotal time for journalism. The industry is undergoing profound shifts from the rise of AI-generated content and platform fragmentation to growing concerns around trust, sustainability, and the business models that underpin quality news reporting. These challenges are reshaping how news is produced, distributed, and consumed. And that's why the report and the conversations it sparks are more important than ever. At Reuters, we're proud to support this work. Innovation is at the heart of what we do, not just to keep pace with change, but also to help shape the future of news. That commitment is enshrined in our trust principles, especially principle number 5, that no effort shall be spared to expand, develop, and adapt the news to maintain its leading position in the international news and information business. Today also is a special milestone because it's the final year with Nick Newman at the head of this report. Nick has been at the helm for the last 14 years from its inception, and his insight, rigour, and leadership have been instrumental in making it what it is today. So we hope you enjoy the findings, the discussion, and the perspective shared this morning. I know I'm looking forward to it very much. So let's dive in. I'm going to hand over to Will Church from the Thompson Reuters Foundation to kick things off.
Thanks very much. Morning, everyone, and delighted to be here at the launch of this year's report. My name is Will Church. I'm the Director of Media Freedom at the Thompson Reuters Foundation. For those of you who may not be aware, the relationship between the Foundation and Oxford and the RASJ goes back more than 40 years now. It started with the launch of our Reuters Fellowship Programme and then continued through to the co-founding of the Institute in 2006. And since then, we've been proudly providing RASJ with its core funding. And that's a commitment that derives from our own mission to strengthen a free press around the world. So the Foundation's work in this space is driven by the complex and ever-changing challenges faced by the sector today, from conflict and crisis driving news outlets into exile, a surge in legal tactics designed to silence independent media, distrust in the news industry, and the dizzying pace of technological development with all those risks and opportunities. For professional journalism to survive and stand out in an increasingly crowded, competitive, and non-discerning digital environment, it needs to both understand the challenges it faces and to anticipate their trajectory. And this is where obviously the digital news report plays such a critical role, an invaluable resource for all of us committed to promoting and protecting free, accurate, and impartial news media, and it has become the profession's benchmark in mapping global digital news trends, and we're delighted to see it now reaches 48 markets. It's a great milestone. At TRF, we're fighting on many, many fronts. Just a snapshot, as we speak, we're training and mentoring reporters around the world. We're developing sustainability and viability of countless media outlets facing all sorts of vulnerabilities in countries where the press itself is under attack. We're supporting newsrooms from East Africa to Latin America to shape their AI adoption policies. And we're providing ongoing and wide-ranging support to media outlets facing some of the most challenging conditions operating in exile. The DNR's rich, world-class data and analysis supports us and our countless partners really working out the coalface with the vital information critical to these operations and more, as I'm sure it does for many other organizations here today. And that's why we're always excited about the new and the next digital news report. In a time of increased political polarization and democratic decline, strengthening editorial excellence and its ability to resonate with audiences is more urgent than ever in our core mission. We are incredibly proud to be part of that mission, and it's research such as this that will govern our ability to shape the future of news and all that depends upon it. And with that, I'm delighted to ask Natalie to come and introduce the report.
Will, thank you very much for that. Good morning. Welcome to colleagues who have come here from across the industry media practitioners, academics. It's wonderful to see you all. This is a very exciting day for us, and I'm glad to see it's a reasonably exciting day for you as well in terms of data. I'm Mitali Mukherjee. I'm director at the Reuters Institute. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, and then Nick Newman, the lead author of the report, will walk all of us through the key highlights, and that will be followed by a panel discussion. So let's dive straight into it. I'm very proud to say this is our largest ever in terms of the markets that we have surveyed. That's 48 markets, nearly 100,000 respondents, representing half the world's population. The introduction of Serbia this year, and it's great to see how we've gone from strength to strength really in terms of the markets that we span. I can say quite confidently this is the width and breadth and depth of international perspective that you won't get in any other report. A little word on the methodology, because I think that's important as well, just to set a bit of context on how we go about doing this. It's online polling, as we have mentioned in the past, so it tends to underrepresent traditional mediums like TV and news and radio when we're looking at cross platforms, and I think that should be taken as such. It's also important to highlight that we have worked with generally populations that have high comfort with English, higher educated, and that does reflect in markets like India, for example, large parts of Africa as well. So please bear that while going through the data and finding the outcome of our surveys. I think the next slide is Nick, so I will only pause to say it takes a village. We are so grateful to our industry partners, Google News Initiative, that continues to be the largest partner supporting the digital news report, but many, many others, 18 others, including the BBC, NHK, Ringier International, Code for Africa, media regulators, industry organizations, and academic institutions. And of course, a big thank you to Reuters for providing support, for providing this space, to Thomson Reuters Foundation, old friends and allies now, and Edelman as well, who have been a valued partner for a long time. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Mitali, and good morning, everybody. So here's a cheery headline. A big theme of this year's report is evidence that traditional media is losing reach, it's losing influence to an alternative ecosystem that includes YouTubers and podcasters. And this has been particularly evident in the United States. And I'm going to start there with a chart that shows weekly reach for some of the main sources of news over time. And you can see how television, print, and online news websites are all trending downwards, despite the fact our survey took place at the time of the Trump inauguration or the week afterwards. At the same time, we can see an increase in the use of social and video networks as a source of news in the last year. So up 6 percentage points, overtaking television in the United States for the first time. So what's interesting is last time round, when Trump was elected in 2016, all forms of media benefited, saw a bump, but this time around the surge was mainly just in those social and video networks. And then on top of that, we see podcasts in the United States ahead of news radio and the emerging use of AI chatbots for news. I should say that we added chatbots and podcasts to this question for the first time this year, so we don't have comparative historical data. So these are averages, and if we split this by age and ask about people's main source of news, their preference, we can start to see what's driving this change. So older people still largely sticking with television, but then younger people increasingly preferring to access news via those social and video networks. So 54% of 18 to 24s in the US say that it's their main source, so up 13 percentage points in the last year. And increasingly, these groups are less likely to say that they prefer to go directly to online news sites or apps. And then linked to these trends, we can also measure name recognition for a number of the sort of personalities who now distribute content not via television, but exclusively via online platforms. So in our survey, 22%, about a fifth of our US samples say they saw Joe Rogan discussing or commenting on news in some way in the previous week. And if we look at his audience, we can see that it's disproportionately made up of young men. So the same audience that traditional media is increasingly struggling to reach. The other aspect of this is that the audience makeup of some of these figures is largely partisan, so the top 5 personalities in our list have mainly right-leaning audiences. There are left-leaning influencers as well, including Brian Tyler Cohen and David Pakman. So obviously a big question is this just an American phenomenon or is it happening elsewhere? So broadly, we do see similar trends elsewhere, but with a bigger impact in some parts of the world. So this chart shows the proportion in selected countries that say social media or video networks are their main source of news. And we see now the US kind of joining increasingly a set of countries such as Brazil, Indonesia, India, where these trends around influencers and alternative media have been evident for some time. On the other hand, we see a slightly different picture in many European countries, also in Japan. Here, social media tends to be used a bit less. Traditional media tends to play a more important role, but perhaps a bigger gap emerging between these sort of different systems. It's important to say that these trends are not just about partisan politics. So they're also driving a huge amount of creativity in terms of formats. They're giving opportunities to new voices. This is one we mentioned last year. Hugo Travers goes under the name Hugo Decrypt, and he's a young news creator in France. He reached a 5th of under 35s in that country each week, and that's enabled him to get access to politicians, to presidents. He was invited recently to the Elysee and asked to put his question directly to the president. So this is another challenge for traditional media. And through our survey, we've been able to identify influencers and creators in many different countries. It's striking, as again we noted last year, so many of them are men using that sort of extended chat format that Joe Rogan also pioneered. But it's important to note that in countries like India, these creators are able to offer different perspectives that are more critical of the government, for example, than traditional media. In Thailand, online influencers like these are extending the range of debate that would previously have been possible in what's a fairly tightly controlled media environment. So linked to the rise of the creator economy and the change of administration in the United States, we're also seeing platforms changing their strategies in terms of what content they promote, but also over issues like moderation and fact-checking. So what's that look like? So this chart shows weekly use for news for different social media and video networks among the 12 markets we have the most long-term traffic tracking data for. And you can see that Facebook remains the most important network, though its influence has been declining as attention has fragmented across networks over time. The big growth, and we talked about this last year, has been in Instagram and TikTok, to some extent YouTube as well over time. These are platforms, of course, less about referral, much more about big hits. It's about consumption within these platforms and primarily consumption around video increasingly. Overall, it's also interesting that X has not declined on aggregate across these countries, and platforms like Blue Sky and Threads are making limited impact, at least with the general public. One interesting side note is that although the overall reach for X in the UK is pretty similar to last year, you can see here how the audience makeup has changed significantly since Elon Musk took over. So in Jack Dorsey's time, Twitter tended to be used mostly by people on the left, a bit of a liberal echo chamber. Some of these people have moved elsewhere, as you can see, but roughly a similar amount of people have been attracted to the network from the right, perhaps by Musk's promises over free speech or some of the support he's given to right-wing figures in the UK like Tommy Robinson. Another important question is, where do people pay attention when they're using some of these networks, like X, for example? Are they looking at news organizations? Are they looking at politicians? Are they paying attention to creators of different kinds, either ones that focus on the news or maybe just do so occasionally? And these charts show a difference, again, in scale between these different systems, between the UK and the US. So in the UK, you can see that people still pay quite a lot of attention to mainstream media organizations, including the BBC and Sky and others, a little bit less to some of these other actors, but you can see it's a very different story on the right-hand side there in the US. A much larger role for some of these alternative creators and influencers, as well as, of course, as politicians who are increasingly building those direct connections as well. Just one other example. So this is looking at TikTok, the network, and we're comparing here Norway with Kenya. And again, we see very a lot of differences based on the system. So in Norway, a lot of the key news brands like VG and Aftenposten, TV2 have invested quite a bit in adapting their content for TikTok, and they're getting a lot of the attention. Whilst in Kenya, alternative sources, including news influencers, are playing a much bigger role. So another topical debate right now is whether platforms like X should be removing more or less content that is seen as being harmful but is not actually illegal. And this is a big tension point right now between Europe and the US. Meta, of course, has also responded to some of these pressures with changes to its moderation rules. But what does the public think about this issue? Well, overall, we find that more people think that too little is being removed than too much. And this is especially the case in the UK and Germany, as you can see. So essentially a desire for more intervention, more moderation. Even in the US, it's actually quite a relatively even picture in aggregate, though opinions are very much, as you can imagine, split by politics. So people on the left think too much is being removed. People on the right think there's already too much intervention. So what we see is divisions between countries and within countries on this issue about where the limits of free speech should lie within social networks. Just looking in a bit more detail at the growth of online video, one of the big themes of the report, this year we brought back a question about preferences. When you are online, do you prefer to read, do you prefer to watch, or do you prefer to listen? And here again we see really interesting differences between countries. So overall, most people, so 55%, say they still prefer to read. So they like the control and the flexibility of using text, for example. In countries like the UK and Norway, we see even stronger preferences for reading and for text. But in some of the other markets that we've already mentioned, like India, like the Philippines, and like Mexico, we find that more people now say that they prefer to watch news online than they do to read it. And even in the UK, where we see that stronger reading tradition, we can see these generational differences playing out. So younger people say they are less likely to prefer reading and more likely to watch or listen when compared with older groups. That brings me neatly on to podcasts, and we've seen a really significant amount of investment from publishers in podcasts over the last few years, include many representatives on the panel, as they chase that younger, rich audience that's interested in news. In the United States, as we've already seen, 15% said they consumed a news podcast quite specific to news in the last week. And digging into the shows that people mentioned, the ones they say they listen to most, we see a split between sort of brand-led, traditional podcasts, if you like, New York Times, The Daily, Up First from NPR, and then this sort of big growth in personality-led opinion podcasts like Joe Rogan, Midas Touch, etc. And one of the big differences in the US is a lot of these are now video-led. So YouTube is the biggest distributor for podcasts, the main access point for podcasts in the US. Slightly different picture in the UK, so smaller proportion of accessing news podcasts, but again, it's a very valuable audience. Again, very personality-led increasingly. That's a big change from a couple of years ago. Some of them are available in video too, but the majority of listening in the UK is through audio platforms like BBC Sounds or Spotify, we find. Moving on to misinformation. So concern about misinformation remains really high around the world and also in the UK. This year we wanted to get people sense of how they check if they suspect something might be false. Where do they go? It's important to say that what people say in surveys may not be what they do in practice. But what we find here is a clear hierarchy of intent. So news sources that people trust is at the top of the list, along with official sources. This is true for young people and old people, so there's something still about that reputation, that heritage, that remains important, even if people don't access these sources as often as they once did. We do see some really interesting differences by age, though. So younger users are more likely to say they would go to social media, for example, to check, also to use comments from other users. So I think that idea of peer-to-peer trust rather than institutional trust is particularly relevant with younger people. What do we mean by trusted brands? So we ask people to name them. And it tends to be, in this context, it tends to be brands with a track record for breaking news, very strong showing for public broadcasters in many parts of the world. Though, of course, a different story in the US, where it's more about which side you personally identify with politically. Brand recognition for fact-checking brands clearly a lot lower, but interesting, I think, to see projects like BBC Verify cutting through alongside some of those more traditional fact-checking organizations. So that brings us on to trust. And I guess the good news here is that trust overall amongst 48 countries is stable, and it's been stable for the last 3 years. 40% say they trust most news most of the time. It's a little bit lower here in the UK. If we look at the patterns over time, in many big countries, we saw a sort of sharp decline in those sort of years of polarization, Brexit in the UK, for example, until we get to COVID. Then we see a bit of a bump, but it's been largely stable since then. And then in some smaller countries, in the Nordics, for example, a similar pattern, but actually for some of them, an increase since COVID. So the picture of trust, not universally depressing. One of the key questions we asked this year was what the news media could do to increase trust. And we coded these responses into some different themes. So the first one is around impartiality or objectivity. People worry that the media has too many biases, too many hidden agendas, it uses loaded language, and they say they would like less of that. They would like the media to present the facts in an objective way and let us make up our own minds. Secondly, a cluster of comments about accuracy, verification again comes up regularly, and it's interesting to see some of those publishers doubling down on that theme. Greater transparency was also widely mentioned. People say they would like journalists to show more of their workings. That might be better labeling around things like conflicts of interest. That ties with the first point. And then finally, better, more distinctive journalism. So more deeply reported, less clickbait, less sensationalism, less Me Too. So I think there's a really consistent picture here, which is, of course, in line with what many journalists would want to provide, but it's not necessarily what news consumers think they're currently getting. So just a final area of focus for this year's report is the emergence of AI as a source of news. I should say this is quite hard to ask about in surveys because consumers aren't always aware that answers they see are generated by AI in different circumstances. But overall, across markets, 7% say that they have used a chatbot to access some kind of news. So those numbers still reasonably small, but it's interesting to see that that figure is twice as high with younger users. As we discussed last year, most people in most countries remain deeply uncomfortable with the idea of using AI in news, particularly where it's generated by the AI with very little human support, even if there's some human checks. So that's the red bars in US and Europe. But broadly, they are more accepting of the idea that AI can be used to assist in a supportive role with humans in the loop. So consistent findings and very similar to last year. Overall, though, when we asked respondents how they felt AI would change the news, we got this very clear picture. So most people feel it's going to make news cheaper to produce, in other words, more abundant, more up to date, but at the same time, less transparent, less accurate, and less trustworthy. So potentially more opportunity for news organizations to emphasize some of these elements, which we've already heard are super important to audiences as a point of differentiation from the AI. Just a few other very quick headlines. There's much more in the report, which I think you all have printed copies of. Firstly, selective news avoidance, something we've been tracking for many years. It remains high, the highest we've seen. In fact, 4 in 10 say they often or sometimes avoid the news. Many avoiders say the news is too negative, there's too much about war, politics, but also, creates arguments they would rather avoid. There's some interest in news personalization, but as ever, people worry about missing out on important stories. However, we do detect some interest in not necessarily personalizing the agenda, but personalizing the formats, potentially using AI to make it more accessible or more relevant. So some of the innovations that we're seeing around AI generated summaries or translating content into different languages, for example. And then in terms of the business model, the majority are still not prepared to pay for online news, but there are big differences. So in the UK, just 10%, it's a bit higher in the US, and a few outliers in Nordic countries. We find that more people would be prepared to pay if it was cheaper or there were more flexible payments. But also, one of the trends we're seeing around bundling, if different services could be packaged together in a convenient format at the right price. So just a quick reminder as we head into the panel discussion. So we find media is losing influence in some countries as politicians, audiences tap into this alternative ecosystem. So some big questions, I think, about how the media responds to these trends and the new competition. Video and audio becoming more important, especially with younger audiences. What is the right mix between text, audio, and video going forwards? Trust remains stable. What are the possibilities of increasing that trust and increasing that connection with audiences as a result? And then finally, AI chatbots just starting to be used as a source of news. How is this going to change the access model from the social media era? So some questions for our panel. I will stop there. Oh, no, there's one more, the news subscriptions. I told you that. Confusing myself. So I will now, I think, invite Mitali and the panel back to the stage. Thank you. Okay.
It is getting going now. Let me introduce and welcome our panel for today. Basia Cummings, digital editor at The Observer, David Rhodes, executive chairman at Sky News, Jane Barrett, head of AI strategy at Reuters. Nick is here to answer any of the prickly questions, and we can get started. Welcome. I'd like to sort of bounce off the last slide and the figure that I tend to watch quite carefully, which is news avoidance at 40%. More and more people responding and saying they feel quite overwhelmed, the news depresses them, especially so for younger audiences that A, don't see value, and second, don't see themselves reflected in what they're reading. Let me ask the three of you to sort of summarize what the news year has looked like. It's sort of changing minute by minute, and really reflect on what your priorities have been for the year gone by and how you're thinking about the next few months. Jane.
Well, I think everyone in this room probably is also a news avoider, if you're sensible. I mean, I think we all have to switch off. When you ask about this year, I mean, we started off the year knowing it was going to be difficult, knowing that we had a new president in the White House who was not particularly friendly towards traditional media. We knew that we had 2 wars going already. We knew that we had the threat of some economic disruption given the changes in the United States. And so we were kind of came into this year braced for a lot of disruption, a lot of change, and a lot of very difficult news to cover. And it's overachieved the expectations, because now we're dealing with another line of war in the Middle East. We are dealing with a president who says things whenever he wants to. He's one of those people that Nick was referring to in terms of going direct to his audience, and it's very difficult to kind of keep fact-checking and keep to keep putting some context, frankly, around everything that is happening. So I don't blame the news avoiders at all. I think it's actually quite sane to avoid news at times. However, I think your point is an interesting one about the age gap. Yeah. And I feel that for Reuters, a lot of our clients are people in this room. You know, we do news as a business. They are the professionals who LSEG serves downstairs, the financial professionals who need news in order to be able to make decisions about where to put their money and how to invest. They are the professionals who come to Reuters.com and to our app, to our events, and the like, who again need news and information in order to be able to run their businesses. So we tend to trend a lot older in terms of our audiences. And so at times, for example, of the tariffs and all of the confusion that's still going on, the tariffs were a huge bump for us. So we kind of got a mini Trump bump, because we got a Trump bump on the economic story. We spun up a newsletter on tariffs very quickly, which got a lot of sign-ups. Just trying to serve our audiences as much as we possibly can with what they need, when they need it, and why they need it. And so I think it becomes ever more important to know your audience, know your brand and to know kind of what you're trying to do in this very difficult moment in history.
David, Sky has gone through a re-strategization as well, and you're thinking more and more about audio and video. How do you put that into context in terms of serving well the audience that is seeking to be served?
There's something for us, and for that we call it a Sky News 2030 plan in every one of Nick's slides, like absolutely every single one.
Chat.
So, particularly as it pertains to video, and we look at those columns and how video consumption varies across markets. But I think there's two aspects of it that are particularly important. First, it's dynamic. So people certainly here in the UK over-index on text, and text remains a very resilient format for delivering our and other journalism. But we have said in this 2030 context that we want to be a video-first news brand, and that's partly because that's our heritage. We're 35, 36 years as an organization that started around delivering television, and so that's our natural strength. But it's partly in the technology context of AI, which enters into the report, obviously, is that we feel we can be a design partner for how these technologies help audiences discover news video. And frankly, we think that the trend away from search and keyword search and search engine optimization and the ability of chatbots to sort of replicate a lot of digital text means that video is a relatively more resilient format.
Basia, The Observer has talked about being sort of tethered to print, as is its legacy, while also looking at more creative things to do in the world of audio and video. How are you doing that, and what's the audience that you're seeking?
So our year has been quite an extraordinary transformation. Two newsrooms coming together, and we're taking a kind of legacy brand more than 230 years old, and for the first time building its unique digital identity. So you use the term compass about this report, and I think it's such a good term because it does give us something to orient around and to understand who we're trying to serve and why. We at The Observer are building something for the first time digitally for that title. And so we are thinking, you know, so many of the points that you pulled out about people looking for personalities and individuals rather than necessarily brands, but still relying on brands for trust. You know, seeking other forms of engagement, not just text, although text does still dominate, looking at ecosystems rather than kind of singular platforms. I think all of those things we're factoring into our thinking in terms of, yes, The Observer is the world's oldest Sunday newspaper, and it is now in new ownership and trying to attract a younger audience because, as we know, print mostly skews towards an older audience. So we're trying to sort of build out to a younger audience, and we're trying to include a kind of awareness of all of these shifts. So thinking differently about newsletters, about our platforms, about our subscriber offering. And of course, the thing that we've brought into this was our podcasting. So at Tortoise, we kind of brought a whole younger audience into sort of news and investigations through podcasts, through weekly and daily shows and sort of limited series. And we can see that it really succeeded in bringing a different kind of audience to our journalism, and so we think that we can bring some of that different way of thinking about the news to The Observer.
Let me move that meter in terms of reaching the audience a little bit to the social media space, increasingly fragmented as the data shows, increasingly looking towards video-first platforms. How are you prioritizing where you want to be while also sort of ensuring that there is sort of allegiance to the brand itself?
Well, I think where we are with The Observer currently, and I should say we are not quite even 10 weeks in. So we really are at the beginning of this kind of extraordinary journey. We, we are thinking about how to, as you said, bring new audiences in, but through podcasts, through newsletters, through our website, we need to sort of innovate and figure out which platforms we think are the ones that we want to place some bets on, because we aren't going to be the kind of newsroom where people go to get their breaking headlines. We can't compete with the Guardian or the BBC. There's no point in us trying to go for volume. What we can do is go through those formats for quality and through building relationships. So, you know, we don't see that our role is to provide information in terms of, you know, at scale. We see ourselves as a place of providing understanding. So we sort of see a second read, somewhere that you go after you've read the headlines, and we sort of want to operate in that space. So I think in that we can see video is going to be very important, podcasts will remain very important, print is going to stay a really core part of who we are, and we've seen that print sales have remained really steady since we've acquired The Observer. So I think for a small newsroom like ours, we need to place some bets, but we can do that with the knowledge that we aren't trying to compete at scale, and I think that gives us a lot of clarity.
David, same question to you, especially when Sky wants to be sort of a video-first destination. Are you picking and choosing between social media platforms? Do you want to have a presence there? How are you thinking about it?
We definitely are looking more and more, and actually driving the newsroom more and more around not just, for instance, video views, but monetizable views. And I don't think there's any shame in that. That there has to be an editorial priority on the stories we're telling and how we're telling them, but there has to be a commercial layer to that too. What many legacy television-based news organizations like ours used to do is make TV and then have sort of an industrial process to lift and shift elements of that to the constellation of social media and other platforms that Nick describes in the report. And that doesn't work. And it doesn't work for a few reasons. First, each of those is different, and the audience expectation on each of those is different. And so it needs to be a bit more bespoke, which is where the second prerogative comes in. All right, where can we achieve the best commercial outcomes, and why don't we prioritize those and deprioritize those that are just broad reach? We're not the only news organization, certainly based here in the UK or anywhere around the world, that is looking at engagement as a replacement for reach, particularly given the AI context of this. And actually, we're very optimistic about that, because products that were designed for broad reach and just to generate tonnage of text to drive search, you know, if we're honest, these weren't great journalistic outcomes. It was just a lot of stuff. And we think we can make higher quality journalism that connects with our heritage as a brand, premium journalism that people might even pay for, and there's evidence in the report that people will pay for that.
Yeah.
But, you know, we'll do it with a lot of craft applied in the places where we can earn a return, and we won't in the places where we can't.
I am going to come to monetization. We'll scratch that one a bit deeper, but just in terms of where you're putting resources and energy, is it podcasts that you'd like to sort of really drill down on? Is it vodcasts? I've noticed the War Games introduction on Sky, or is it a whole other space?
Podcast, vodcast, I think, first we have to think about that as essentially the same. It is the case that in the US, podcasts are much more consumed on YouTube, but I think we should expect them to increasingly be consumed in video form in this and in other markets where we operate as well. I mean, YouTube did become, I think it's fair to say, globally in the fourth quarter, the biggest platform for podcast consumption. Now that's largely lopsided, driven by the American result in the survey.
And India.
But it's coming, but exactly, it is coming up, and it is coming up fast. But this is one place where, in addition to the stability, arguably at a low basis, but the stability of that trust metric, there's some things that are different, but some things that are always the same in news media. And podcasts are going to become more like television. Television is going to become more like podcasts. And you're seeing in some of the presenters of them some merging of these worlds. I think it's all going to be much more of a vodcast type of feeling on sort of live streaming and legacy television, and a little bit more of a higher production value in what typically had been thought of as VOD and podcasts.
Sure. Jane, the other highlight of social media from the year gone by was how news organizations made decisions about whether or not they wanted to be present on X. There's some interesting findings there, including the fact that audiences, or at least sort of numbers, actually went back up. Again, over-indexing for right-leaning, over-indexing for young men. Was that something you had to think about as an organization, or was it quite clear that you would be on all social media platforms present?
I mean, there are certainly some debates in the newsroom. Journalists have opinions, and they can take their decisions for themselves as to where they want to be sharing their stories and their thoughts, and find their sources and have conversations and the like. I think that the resilience of X, was something that we expected. I think it's probably outperformed the resilience that we were expecting. But we have, in Joe mentioned at the beginning, our trust principles, and part of our trust principles is about impartiality. So we do not make decisions based on kind of the political leanings of somebody or not. X used to be a very, very good partner, a very active partner. It's now a less active partner, but it's still a very good way to reach people with journalism. I just think that for us, obviously, we want to, as David was saying, you want to have that sort of the commercial imperative of your editorial decisions as to where you're going to be, but also we feel that, being on the social media platforms might not be our biggest money spinner, but it's really important for us for three main reasons. One is to reach that younger audience. As I mentioned before, our audience skews older. And we want the younger audience to understand what Reuters is. So who are we? We've been around for 174 years. Why should they? How do you pronounce us? And then why should you trust us? So that's really, really important, is to get to that younger audience. Second thing is that, as Nick mentioned, there is a need for people to then go and find, like, what is true. I've been seeing all of this stuff. I mean, I found myself doing the same thing the other night when the missile started landing in Tel Aviv, and I was watching some of the videos coming through on X, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's extraordinary. But like, is it true? I don't know if it's true, or is it from somebody's very clever computer game that they're just spreading stuff? And so you need to be there to show that there is a path to truth. And then the third thing, I think, kind of comes a little bit more into the trust and a bit of the personality stuff, which is really, and I was so interested by Nick's finding about the transparency piece, explaining a little bit about what it is. And actually one of my colleagues in here, Tristan, was sharing with the company last week the story about how we took our TikTok following up to over 1 million. And some of the videos were just like showing behind the scenes. There was so much interest in the conclave and the Pope and everything else like that, and taking the audience behind the scene and showing them some of our photographers who never even get a byline, some of our video journalists who are doing great work, and actually taking people behind and showing them how it all happens also can help to build trust. So those are three great, really good reasons to be there. And so I think if you then, going back to your original question, if you then go, well, we're not going to be on X anymore, that sends a very political message which would go against our independence, and also it doesn't satisfy those three needs that I have.
And interestingly, I think as has been documented, the conclave was one of those stories that really drew in younger audiences, particularly on platforms like TikTok.
I did not think that 2025's word was going to be Pope-core for me, but there you go, it was.
The world needs a hero. Nick, talk a little bit about Twitter X, and were you surprised by the findings? It's also not just the US, it's a couple of other markets like Poland and Australia where we are seeing a resurgence.
Yeah, I mean, I think most publishers in the room would recognize that there's less value from X in terms of referrals, so that's why publishers are kind of moving to other platforms. But in terms of ordinary people, there's still a lot going on there, and so we see increases in different parts of the world. I mean, my own personal view is that publishers just need to be much more strategic about the way they use different platforms. So as we've heard on the panel already, which audiences we're trying to meet, in which countries, which platforms are they on, what's in it for us? Are we looking for referral? Are we looking for marketing to try and start to build a relationship, as Jane was saying? And I think for too long we've just sort of seen platforms as a way of getting easy reach rather than thinking really strategically about what we want to do, and the balance between getting people to come to our own platforms and building that loyalty and finding new ways to get audiences, which will remain important, of course.
David, the big one is personality-based news persons, I should say. Influencers feels still a little bit uncomfortable, but here we are, the news influencer ecosystem. How are you approaching that? Is that an opportunity? Is there sort of partnerships to explore there? Because right now it's a bit of a mishmash, isn't it? Both in terms of the platforms they're present in, what they talk about, which is sometimes news, but sometimes also lifestyle and entertainment and food. And sometimes right-leaning, as is the case for America, but sometimes critical of government, and that's the only space they can be that way.
There's a reality here, which is that the individual that's presenting you the story, whether we want to call them a personality, a presenter, a reporter, a correspondent, an influencer, talent. Some of those words have a pejorative, even in our own newsroom. Some of those words don't. All of them kind of describe the same person in different settings. But I think one of the things that we take away from this and other work that's been done, maybe not as comprehensive work that's been done, is the intersection between the trust factor and individuals that are the individual followership. It was the case that I think when many of us got into this business, including me at Reuters, I realized coming in here today, that was my first legitimate work ex in this industry very long time ago. But anyway, when we got into the business, trust was largely held by big institutional brands and conferred by those brands onto the individuals presenting it. And that has flipped 180 degrees. Trust is largely given or lent to individual reporters, and they have the ability to sort of confer that on us as an institutional brand day to day, or at least that's the pattern that we see, and that's part of what we're building our future plan around.
Are you actively looking to engage with talent, for lack of a better description?
Well, I think we do already, in the sense of, I think that people are drawn as much to, for instance, what Beth Rigby, as our political editor, has to report today about Westminster, or says on her Electoral Dysfunction podcast, as they are drawn to sort of Sky News in a generic sense for its Westminster report. So to the degree that if you take that aspect of the report, that the Westminster report is driven by Beth and Sam Coates and Sophie Ridge and Trevor Phillips and a number of other people, that the audience, different aspects of the audience, trust and respond to and follow, well, that ends up having a halo on us. But I think it's much more that direction than it is, I mean, it's obviously a two-way street, but I think it's much more that direction than it was a generation ago.
Basia is an organization that has sort of described itself as being the second read, which is your approach to audiences. How are you thinking about personalities? I mean, even in genres like podcasts, for example, Tortoise Media in the past has enjoyed a younger audience, a more sort of female audience. Are you looking to collate the two of them in some way?
Absolutely. I mean, the amazing thing about The Observer is it is just jam-packed full of people that readers love. Nigel Slater, Eva Weissman, Andrew Rawnsley. And so a big part of what we're doing over the next year is kind of building their own platforms around them. Of course, they have their own followings on social media, but exactly as David's saying, it's about sort of, utilizing them to bring new people to The Observer. And we need to find that sort of next generation of observer voices, and that's something that we've spent a lot of the last few months doing, and bringing new reporters, new commentators into our orbit. But I also wanted to pick up on what Jane said about sort of transparency, because that's something that we took really seriously at Tortoise, and it's something that we kind of staked our difference on, that we were going to be an open newsroom. And partly that meant opening up our newsroom physically so that people could come and spend time with us, participate in our news meetings, but it also meant showing our workings. And that was really important in our podcast, so in all of our kind of narrative, investigative series that we built our name around. It was really I guess, an exposing experience at first, but definitely one that we sort of settled into, which is the way that we're going to show new audiences who we are and how we work and what we care about is by being open. And we've really committed to taking that spirit into the Observer. So whether that's in the podcast that we're going to develop now as part of the Observer, whether that's in the war game that we've just released with Sky, or whether that's in the paper or online, that sense of you understand the decisions that we're taking before you get the thing in your hand or before you see the content, and that you understand who the individuals are that came to those decisions. I think that's really important. And just about the kind of those sympathetic networks that you mentioned, I think we would be really naive to say, that they are negative. That when we think of it as sort of Trump goes directly to his sympathetic network in order to get his message out, of course we can see that has a huge political impact, and it impacts on the news ecosystem. But I think one of the things that newsrooms, I think historically, have been less good at is collaboration and being kind of distributed across platforms. And I think that's something that is now shifting, partly because we have to. But you can see that the way that we're all talking about our organisations is less monolithic. It's much more about a kind of an assembly of many parts that goes out into the world in sort of different places and brings people in differently. And I think that is a great sign of innovation and is a response to these findings, I think.
Jane, AI, your area of specialty. Chatbots emerging for the first time, particularly for the under 25s. Reuters has worked at pace with AI innovation, both internally and externally. Just talk to us a little bit on what the year has been like.
It's only been a year. Where are we?
So she said.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I think and I'm a couple of weeks off my 1-year anniversary as head of AI strategy, so it really has been a year. Thompson Reuters as an overall company really didn't just lean in, but really jumped into generative AI after ChatGPT 3.5 came out in 2022. Our CEO of Thomson Reuters, Steve Hasker, has a leadership meeting every January. It's organised well in advance, and he scrapped everything for the January 2023 meeting and made it all about generative AI. So the poor organisers aged very quickly over that last month and a half. But it actually set a pace for us as a company, that this is something that we're taking very seriously. We're setting aside a lot of capex. It was 100 million for the first year. It's now 200 million of investment a year into how generative AI is going to change all knowledge work. So Reuters is just 10% of Thomson Reuters. Our colleagues out there are working on lots of products for lawyers, for tax and accounting professionals, for corporates trying to manage their internal processes. And I think we've all seen the headlines about kind of how many jobs might be impacted, or how jobs might be impacted, how the knowledge economy might be changed by AI. So our position was very much that we're going to lead that and not have it happen to us.
We've seen fairly different responses, Jane, in terms of the regions we're looking at. So across Asia, for example, there's much higher degrees of comfort with engaging with AI and news, very, very different in Europe as a continent. Have you had to sort of change the tone and tenor as well across regions? Because I know you've done lots of exciting work in the Far East, in Latin America. Are you moving the dial up and down depending on the region?
Not really. We are a global organisation reporting on the world for the world, and so we have to have kind of standard ways of working and the like for our newsroom. So when we're looking internally, the tools that we are releasing, we will often release where we've got the most data to start with, and that does tend to be the English language markets, just because there's more data that we can train on. But we're very quickly then trying to expand out to other languages, other formats, other ways of processing news and the like. So we have a goal that's just been upped from 50% to 100% of people using AI at least 20 times in a month. So that's the adoption goal. And it's been really, really interesting as we've been holding our town halls and helping people along, finding out what they need in order to be able to go along on this AI journey for themselves. That there's always a good amount of journalistic cynicism about things, which there should be, and I appreciate it, because sometimes you can spend too much time with people who are so full on to AI that nothing else matters, and then you need the journalist to come prick your bubble occasionally and say, but how about this? So I think there's kind of a good a good mix of the conversation, but it doesn't really so much change internally by our different teams. I think what's going to be very interesting is to look at externally where certain features get picked up or not. We've only just started rolling out some AI features on our website and our app. There's a big roadmap for us to get through this year, but we're doing it very, very cautiously, precisely because of the points that came out in the study about the fears that people have about the accuracy and the trust. And so we need to make sure, even though we'll have all of the disclosures that we need and the like, disclosure is one thing, but you actually do still stand for trust. And so I'm going to be interested to see, for example, if text-to-speech or if summarization or if some of the other features that we've got coming out take off more in America and Britain, which are two of our, and Canada, which are three of our kind of biggest markets for our app, or in India, where we're seeing lots of requirements much more for listening or watching the news. And so I think as we start to roll out across the different markets and we start to get the data back, it's going to help inform the decisions that we make for the next steps.
Nick, do you want to talk about that? It's the birth of that tiny little bar in terms of AI chatbots.
Not so tiny.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that definitely surprised me was these regional differences that we really picked up this year. And actually, if you look across Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, we're seeing a lot more AI avatars, AI presenters, a lot more innovation, and that's partly because the comfort with AI is much higher. Whether this is well placed or not is another question. So, yeah, and it's still early days. For me, the big question is, I mean, lots of stuff that media companies are doing, but what is going to happen with the access model? And so how fast will that grow? Will it just be search engines? Will it be aggregators of different kinds incorporating that? And what will that do to the news industry from the business model point of view, from the referral point of view? I think that's the big question right now.
Yeah.
David, do you want to come in on that? There are sort of right and present fears of reduced traffic. Content licensing deals are underway, but it still feels very much like the largest giant gets the most, and the smaller newsrooms actually don't get access to that conversation.
I mean, this is definitely that aspect of the discussion is something that plays out, especially, for instance, in our newsroom in Italy, which performs well in the survey, but I think shares a concern of many journalists working in other than the sort of biggest 3 to 5 languages, or frankly, many just not working in English, that AI is going to swamp the boat of regional voices and culturally relevant material in different markets. That being said, I think the industry discussion around this has been very much around newsroom tools or how journalism reaches audiences versus where we want to position ourselves, which is mostly thinking about where our journalism ends up in the wild and how it's compensated. And so we're very focused on attribution models, and our initial partnerships in this area have been with outfits like ProRata, a product from Idea Lab, which identifies or does the best that an algorithm at the moment can do to identify whose material is whose in responses to prompts. And then once that has been done, to make sure that the economics that we need to support our journalism are supported by these technologies. So this is why we've come out and will continue to come out strongly for retrieval augmented generation, or RAG models, imperfect and being developed, but absolutely critically important to determining journalistic outcomes in this new place, which, by the way, we're optimistic about. I mean, it is the case that keyword and keyword search and search engine optimization are going down. How fast they're going down or how long that tail is, I think, has some regional characteristics. And what it can be replaced by, generative engine optimization, retrieval augmented generation, a whole host of other acronyms that we don't have to bore people with, is really critically important and actually could lead to fewer stories told better, more context, identifying audiences that are willing to pay for quality journalism. Those are not necessarily bad outcomes, and we really want to put some shoulder behind them.
I don't know how I'm doing with timekeeping, not very well, I think, but I do want to bring in a quick note from all of you on subscription, because that's something all three of you have sort of raised your hand with. Reuters with a metered paywall, The Observer and Sky talking about looking at subscriptions. 70% of those surveyed have said nothing will get them to pay. I know Nick has pointed to a silver lining of bundling, etc., but that number hasn't really changed over the years. How's it going?
Well, we only launched our subscription on our website and our app last October. It's been growing steadily. We've only launched it in certain countries. We're sort of doing a global rollout as we go. But one of the things that I noticed in Nick's in the study is the question about the cost, you know, and having different options and, you know, a way of getting in. And so the strategic decision that we've taken at Reuters is that there's going to be a flat baseline cost. So it's $1, it's €1, it's £1 a week, and it will stay there. It's not an entry level thing. It's not a early birds get this, and then we're going to sting you later on. But it's been set low because we want to keep access to the news available for people. And I know that still, you know, £1 a week might be more than they're willing to pay, but that's kind of where we've set it. And we're seeing good growth through it. And I think the other interesting thing is it also allows us both to know our audience much better, to be able to do product development much better, because we actually are understanding kind of how those signed-in subscribers are using news, how they're navigating, how we can help them to navigate better, how we can make the value of Reuters much more important to them. So it's not going to be the majority of our revenue, but it's giving us so much really, really valuable information.
Last year, early days, but there is that target of 100,000 subscribers, and there is the intent to go behind a paywall of sorts.
Yes, so at the moment where we are is we've launched a kind of interim website, but we are working behind the scenes to build a kind of subscriber app and a new version of the Observer website. And in the autumn, the idea is that we'll be ready to start asking people to pay for our journalism. But I think, I mean, it's not great news when you look at the slides, but I think when you think about what a newsroom can provide in an expanded sense, we know, for example, if you look at the New York Times, cooking and puzzles are a huge part of their subscription business. You know, newspapers traditionally provided utility. You could, you know, see the TV listings, you could get the stocks and shares, you could get the weather. Utility is a really important thing that you can now get in so many places. And so I think newsrooms, and particularly us at The Observer, have to think about what are the other forms of utility beyond news that a newsroom can offer that feels different, that feels meaningful, that still speaks to all the things that we know is important around transparency and personality-driven offerings, and thinking about, you know, platforms and where people are. So I think, you know, it might be that people don't want to pay for news, but they do want to pay for an organisation that might be providing them with lots of different ways in, where news becomes a part of it, but not the entirety of the subscription.
We can circle back next year, but you are looking at premium content.
Except that the one discount that I'd apply to the discussion around payments is that many people, even who answer the survey question, I don't want to pay for this, are paying. That if you look at news media since the beginning, usually it's paid for indirectly. And usually the most lucrative revenue streams that we have had as a segment of media have been indirect. So in their day, the greatest newspapers with the biggest print circulation were mostly paid for by the classified ads at the back of the paper, not by people, the punter, going and putting a certain amount of money down on a physical copy. Or the economics that supported US television-based news media for most of the time I was working in it, and even still today, were largely built around US cable distribution subscriber fees, which are, you know, people paying a cable provider that then doled out distribution fees to programmers whether they watch the channels or not. And then there's puzzles of the New York Times and so on and so forth. Most people, they're paying a BBC license fee. Some of that money makes its way to the newsroom. Most people are paying for something. Most people don't want to pay. But that's true of everything, right? So in that environment, how we will show up with a paid premium offering is in a variety of ways. There are going to be certain products we provide that we think people will pay for very directly. There'll be others where if we've managed to achieve a certain number of subscribers, for instance, to a newsletter, and that's an interesting addressable audience, we could sell them other things. I think this whole question of payments and who pays and how is much more complex and nuanced than just who's going to actually fork over cash for a news offering. Because, by the way, if you ask many of us, and we're in this business, I think we'd like to see those numbers be higher, but it's not our own behavior. If we can get something without paying for it directly, we'd prefer that option.
We've already been self-nominated as news avoiders and now non-news payers as well. I want to make space for a few questions. Best way to do that is to raise your hand. I'm assuming there are mics that could reach you, and then you can pose your question. The lady in front here, please. If we could get her a mic.
Laura?
In the white jacket.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring sharing. I think in the room a lot of traditional journalists. So what's your suggestions for traditional journalists to adapt for this dynamic environment and challenge? And the other thing is, with AI and a lot of modern technology, for the new young generation, they want to aim to do journalism. What's your advice? Thank you very much.
Is that question specifically for someone on the panel?
No. So if anyone would like
Jean,
to
would
give
you like
us
to take that?
thoughts, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I started in a newsroom last millennium. I can now say that. And, the newsroom I walked into in 1999 was very, very different from the newsroom today of 2025. And I've had to keep on changing, year by year by year. And I think the key thing for most traditional journalists is to have an open mindset and to have a learning mindset, to be looking out at things, to see kind of what's happening out there, and to think, how do you fit in? How do you fit in yourself? How does the brand fit in? What should you be suggesting? And coming up with those ideas, pitching them to the editors, but also just making sure that you're challenging yourself. And then in terms of the entry-level jobs, it's something that I was less worried about last year than I am now. I see it kind of as a greater threat now. But I do think that, again, when I speak to the young journalists around Reuters, they are very often the ones who are playing the most with AI tools. They're the ones who are seeing themselves as partnering with AI to do journalism. They are working out kind of how to use the models and the techniques. They're training themselves. I was speaking to somebody just last week who's only been in the company for 2 years, and she was teaching me how to do things, and it's apparently my job. And I just think that's kind of what we need. We need those plastic minds that really care about the core of journalism and why we're doing journalism, and then bring a huge amount of wit, of intelligence, of open-mindedness, of experimenting mindset into the workplace.
Teenagers at home often fill the same gap. Over there, I think was there a hand up there? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Renee, hi.
Interesting. I had a question about paying, but also audiences and demographics. So many media, for obviously very good reasons, have been pursuing younger audiences, and I heard that a lot again today, because they are the audiences of the future. But the audiences that still have that fleeting propensity to pay are older ones. How are you thinking about that at all? I mean, are you thinking about how those audiences who are still paying and willing to pay, if there are issues of retention or keeping them on board, or even thinking specifically about targeting the ones who are still paying today? Does that and can that factor in?
Is that for David?
I'm sorry?
Is that question for David?
If actually David and Basha both, I'd be
Yeah.
keen to hear if you had a view on it. Thank you very much.
I can answer from a sort of newspaper perspective. Of course, in print, our readership skews older. And so one of the challenges that we have now is to bring them closer. These are people who buy us at the newsstand, so we don't have a kind of close relationship with them. We know they exist, we know that they're loyal, but we don't know their names, we don't have their email addresses. So sort of step one in our process is going to be to bring those loyal print readers closer to us to say, look, that we're building this digital product for you too, where the things that you love in print also exist in this bigger ecosystem, and there are other things for you here too. So it's really important to us that that older readership isn't somehow excluded by the pursuit for a younger and new readership or listenership, however we want to characterize them. At the same time, we know that there is a structural decline in the newspaper industry, and we have to innovate and build something new. And I think that's where trying to identify the new audiences, as we did at Tortoise, we found a broad, younger and skewing female audience for our investigative news-based podcast, which is unusual. So, we're hoping that the skills and the kind of knowledge that we built in doing that and the strategy that we have with print will enable us to bring these two audiences together, not at the expense of each other, but to have a varied subscriber base. I think where we don't know the answers is how many of them are there, how quickly can we do it, and what do we need to build in order to do it in the next year or 2 years. Those are things we don't yet have answers for. But I think it feels good to be trying.
David, and to say we're sort of living through, as we speak, a cost of living crisis, huge income inequity, felt perhaps most sorely by this younger audience that Renee is pointing to.
I think there's journalistic and also commercial risks in trying to tailor a news product too much to like a demographic cohort. I think it's easier, it's a little purer journalistically, but also potentially delivers more commercially if what we can do is, and what we are doing is try to identify addressable audiences for particular kinds of journalism and particular journalists, and then super serve those. Then you're sort of on solid ground editorially, and you also have a better commercial proposition because you identified this willingness to pay. I think when you enter into both the editorial and the commercial conversation, a sort of highly demographic targeting, it leads to bad outcomes.
A quick final question there, the lady on the side.
Thanks for this, it's been absolutely fascinating. Can I just ask maybe Nick about this showing our workings? It's obviously the kind of zeitgeist, isn't it? We've got Verify, Basha mentioned it. Have we got any evidence yet that this is going to renew trust, or is it kind of instinctive and we hope it'll renew trust?
Yeah, it's what people say in surveys, isn't it? But I think it's interesting. It was interesting to me anyway to see how many people reflected back when we asked them, some of these things that lie behind it. So it may not be they want everything to be labelled, but it's also about wanting to see the biases or to have them laid out much more clearly so they can understand where things are coming from. So I think it's going to, what we found last year is it really kind of works quite well with people who already trust you, but it's not going to persuade people who already don't trust you. And I think that's a challenge with the strategy. It's kind of reinforcing for people who already like news, already think quality journalism is under threat, but for other people, probably less so.
I will say there's a couple of other subsets, aren't there, Nick, in terms of cross-cutting this. It is generally audiences from lower income backgrounds, people with lower levels of education who also tend to have both less trust but also less access to the news. Thank you to our fantastic panel for joining today. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the co-authors of this report, Amy Ross Arguedas, Craig Robertson, Richard Fletcher, who is Director of Research at the Institute, and Rasmus Kleis-Nielsen, formerly Director at the Institute, and of course to the fantastic Reuters team that makes this happen. And I want to pause and say thank you to the man who has led this report for the last 14 years. Digital News Report, as it started with 6 countries under David Levy. It then sort of scaled to new heights with Rasmus, and here we are. Nick, it has been an absolute privilege to work with you. And I don't want to say this is goodbye, because it isn't. You're just going to see his name on a different report. But please join me in saying a very, very big thank you to Nick Levy. And also delighted to point you towards another gentleman in the room, Jim Egan, who takes on this not so small task from next year. Jim Egan will be taking on the role of lead author of the Digital News Report. It's wonderful to have you on the team, and we're looking forward to many sleepless nights, Jim. Thank you all.
Cool. Okay.